My name is Zora. I am 35 years old, and for years my husband's family treated me like a glorified secretary. They had no idea I was the shadow founder of a multi-million-dollar financial technology acquisition firm. Last Saturday, during the catered housewarming party for the sprawling historic Georgia estate, my parents sacrificed 15 years to secure for me my mother-in-law raised her crystal glass. She announced to the entire ballroom that she was moving into my master wing because her legacy family deserved the finest. When my husband smugly handed her a set of keys he had secretly cut, I snatched them right out of the air. His smile vanished as I stood my ground, making his mother's face drain of all color. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to in-laws who severely underestimated your worth. The clink of fine crystal echoed through the grand foyer of my new estate, cutting sharply through the soft jazz playing in the background. The chandelier light caught the amber liquid in my father's glass as he cleared his throat to speak. My father, Elijah, had spent decades working grueling civil service shifts alongside my mother, Brenda. They saved every single dime they could, scraping together resources to ensure their daughter had the generational wealth they were historically denied. This night was supposed to be their triumph. I watched my father raise his glass, his calloused hands trembling slightly with pride as he looked around the magnificent room, and then at me. But before he could finish his heartfelt toast, a sharp, piercing chime shattered the moment. Vivian, my 62-year-old mother-in-law, stood at the center of the room, aggressively tapping her silver spoon against a champagne flute. She adjusted her designer silk wrap, making absolutely sure every gaze in the room shifted away from my father and landed directly on her. Vivian was obsessed with Atlanta high society, her sorority legacy, and reminding everyone that her bloodline was supposedly superior to my hardworking parents. To Vivian, my family was strictly blue-collar and therefore unworthy of true respect. "If I may interrupt," Vivian announced, her voice projecting across the catered spread of crab cakes and caviar. She did not wait for permission or acknowledge my father lowering his glass. "While we appreciate Elijah's quaint little speech about hard work, let us talk about the future of this magnificent home. A historic estate like this requires a certain pedigree to maintain its grace." She paced slowly across the original hardwood floors, running a manicured hand over the polished mahogany banister as if she already owned the place. "Julian and I have been discussing the layout." Vivian continued, flashing a brilliant artificial smile at the wealthy guests she had invited to my house. "It is only fitting that the elders of a true legacy family occupy the finest quarters. My husband and I will be moving into the master wing by the end of the month." A dead silence fell over the room. My parents froze near the fireplace. My mother, Brenda, gripped my father's arm, her eyes wide with shock. I stared at Vivian, my pulse drumming a frantic rhythm in my ears. This woman who had contributed absolutely nothing to this property, who had sneered at the neighborhood when we first viewed the listing, was publicly laying claim to the home my parents had secured for me. Before I could even formulate a response to this sheer audacity, my husband Julian stepped out from the crowd. He was smiling a broad, arrogant smile that made my stomach turn. Julian loved playing the heavy-hitting executive even though he was just a mid-level corporate manager. He walked straight over to his mother, completely ignoring my parents who were standing just feet away. "You are absolutely right," Mother Julian said, his voice dripping with performative charm. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy set of freshly cut brass keys. The metal jingled loudly in the quiet room, a sound of pure betrayal. "I had these made yesterday. The master suite is yours." He held his hand out, dropping the keys toward Vivian's outstretched, eager palm. I did not think. I reacted. I stepped forward and snatched the keys directly out of the air before they could touch her skin. My fingers closed tightly around the jagged metal, the sharp edges biting into my palm. Vivian gasped loudly, clutching her chest in an exaggerated display of shock. Julian's arrogant smile vanished, instantly replaced by a dark, furious scowl. The guests began to murmur, the tension in the room thickening until it was hard to breathe. The jazz music suddenly seemed far too cheerful for the heavy hostility radiating from the center of the foyer. Julian closed the distance between us and grabbed my arm. His grip was bruising and tight in an attempt to exert physical dominance hidden from the guests behind the folds of my dress. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, but his voice was loud enough for the nearest tables to hear clearly. "Give her the keys, Zora," he hissed through clenched teeth, his eyes blazing with anger. "Stop being so selfish and ghetto in front of polite company." The word ghetto hung in the air, a loaded weapon designed to put me in my place. Julian expected me to shrink to hand over the brass keys and bow my head in submission to preserve his family's precious public image. He expected the quiet administrative consultant he thought he married to absorb the humiliation to protect his ego. But Julian did not know that the woman standing before him had spent the last 5 years ruthlessly acquiring and liquidating failing companies. He did not know that I had already quietly paid off the remaining mortgage on this estate a year ago using funds from my covert holding company. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. Then I looked up into his eyes, letting the icy calm of my true nature surface. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply held the keys tighter, feeling the cool metal warm against my skin, a tangible symbol of the power they were trying to steal from me. The absolute audacity of my husband standing in the home my parents sacrificed to build, attempting to hand over the master suite to a woman who openly despised my bloodline, ignited a fire in my chest. But a successful businesswoman never sets a fire without securing the exits first. I did not release my grip on the brass keys. Instead, I took a deliberate step back, forcing Julian to drop his hand from my arm. The cold metal pressed into my palm, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I looked directly into Julian's eyes and clearly told him no. I told him this was my house purchased through the blood and sweat of my parents, and absolutely no one was moving into the master wing. Vivian gasped, but the theatrical shock quickly melted away, revealing the ugly, bitter reality underneath. Her polite high society facade shattered completely. She slammed her champagne flute onto a passing waiter's silver tray with enough force to crack the crystal stem. She turned her venomous gaze toward my parents Elijah and Brenda, who were standing quietly near the marble fireplace. Vivian launched into a vicious tirade. She announced to the silent room of wealthy guests that she refused to be humiliated by people who spent their entire lives sweating in civil service uniforms. She pointed a manicured finger at my father, mocking the 30 years he spent working for the municipal government, claiming that no amount of saved pennies could buy actual class or pedigree. She loudly declared that a historic estate of this magnitude required a legacy family to maintain its dignity, not a pair of blue-collar retirees who probably did not even know how to properly address the hired help. My father's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward to defend my mother, but I immediately held up my free hand, signaling him to stop. I would not let them engage with her toxicity. I refused to let my parents lower themselves to defend the honor they had already proven by providing for me. The sharp clink of ice in a heavy crystal tumbler drew the room's attention. Trent, my white brother-in-law, stepped forward from the shadows of the grand staircase. He wore a smug, condescending smile that he usually reserved for people he deemed financially illiterate. Trent took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon, acting like a benevolent mediator trying to calm down a hysterical woman. He told me I needed to lower my voice and think rationally. He said it was cute that my parents managed to scrape together a meager down payment for the property, but owning an estate of this size required real capital and a fundamental understanding of generational wealth. Trent began pacing the grand foyer, addressing the room as if giving a real estate seminar to a group of slow learners. He looked directly at me and said that people from my demographic rarely understood the crushing reality of property taxes, maintenance fees, and historic preservation costs. He used the words "my demographic" with a heavy, deliberate emphasis, letting the racial and classist undertones hang thickly in the air. Trent claimed that within 6 months, the taxes and upkeep alone would force me into absolute bankruptcy. He told the gathered crowd that Julian was not trying to steal the house, but was simply trying to save me from inevitable financial ruin. He insisted that the only logical solution was for me to sign the deed over to Julian immediately, allowing the men in the family to handle the complicated business of wealth management. Julian stood tall, puffing out his chest, completely validating Trent's insulting narrative. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and superiority, telling me to listen to Trent, because Trent understood the high stakes of commercial real estate. Julian promised that once my name was officially off the deed and his mother was comfortably settled in the master suite, he would graciously allow my parents to visit the grounds on major holidays. I looked at the three of them standing together in my foyer. Vivian with her unearned arrogance, Trent with his coded racism and fake financial superiority, and Julian, the man who was supposed to be my partner, eagerly trying to strip me of my property. I did not scream. I did not argue. I let them bask in their absolute delusion. As Trent continued to lecture me about impending bankruptcy and the dangers of playing out of my league, I kept my face entirely blank. I did not mention that I was the shadow founder and majority shareholder of a financial technology acquisition firm that processed more capital in a single morning than Trent had seen in his entire miserable life. I did not tell them that the crushing property taxes Trent was so deeply worried about had already been paid in full for the next 5 years. And I certainly held back the fact that exactly 12 months ago I had wired a single untraceable cash payment from my corporate account to the bank, paying off the entire 30-year mortgage in one afternoon. I owned the estate free and clear, right down to the foundation. I let the silence stretch, absorbing every insult, every condescending remark, storing them away as ammunition for the war to come. I looked at Trent, then at Julian, and finally locked eyes with Vivian. I opened my mouth to speak, knowing my next words would ignite a conflict they were entirely unprepared to fight. Before I could utter a single syllable, my sister-in-law Camille pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She adjusted her designer silk blouse and let out a high-pitched laugh that grated against my nerves. She tilted her head back, pretending to admire the intricate molding of the grand staircase, but her eyes were darting around, calculating square footage. "Oh, Vivian, do not be so hasty," Camille said, waving her hand toward the back of the property. "Trent and I were just discussing the guest house near the pool. It has that gorgeous wrap-around porch and plenty of natural light for my morning yoga. Since you and Julian are taking the master wing, it only makes sense for us to take the guest house. We can turn this entire estate into a proper family compound. Think of the garden parties we could host." Julian nodded enthusiastically, wrapping an arm around his sister. "That sounds perfect, Camille. We can get the movers out here by next weekend." I stared at them. The sheer volume of their entitlement was breathtaking. They were dividing up my property, standing in my foyer, drinking my champagne, and carving out sections of my home like it was a freshly baked pie. They had completely bypassed asking for permission and jumped straight into claiming ownership. I looked at Julian, who was currently smiling at his sister, completely ignoring the fact that I was still holding the brass keys he had tried to give away. He really thought I was going to stand there and accept this invasion. He really believed I was weak enough to let his mother and sister turn my sanctuary into their personal playground. I uncurled my fingers and let the sharp edges of the brass keys press into my skin one last time. Then I slowly, deliberately dropped the keys deep into the pocket of my dress. The heavy thud of the metal hitting the fabric echoed in the sudden silence of the room. Julian frowned, his smile finally faltering. "Zora, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Give those back right now." I stepped past Julian, completely ignoring him, and closed the distance between myself and his mother. Vivian straightened her spine, trying to look down her nose at me, but I held my ground. I looked her dead in the eye, letting all the warmth drain out of my expression. "Nobody is moving into the master wing, Vivian," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying across the silent foyer. "And nobody is taking the guest house. This is my home. You are a guest here tonight, and your invitation has officially expired. I suggest you head over to the catering table, grab a complimentary crab cake, and find the front door." The entire room sucked in a collective breath. Several of Vivian's wealthy socialite friends actually gasped out loud. Vivian's mouth fell open. For a full 3 seconds she was completely speechless, her brain unable to process that the quiet, obedient daughter-in-law had just ordered her out of the house. Then the shock melted away, and her face turned an ugly, mottled shade of purple. The polite high society mask disintegrated entirely, leaving behind a vicious, desperate woman. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You arrogant, classless little gold digger. You think because your name is on a piece of paper you have power over me. You are nothing but a commoner trying to play dress-up in a world you do not belong in. You tricked my son into marrying you because you wanted access to our legacy, our name, our connections. And now you want to humiliate me in front of my friends." She pointed a trembling finger right at my face, stepping so close I could smell the gin on her breath. "You are destroying this family's reputation. You are a parasite feeding off my son's hard work while your pathetic parents stand there and watch." The moment she brought my parents into it, the atmosphere shifted. My father Elijah had stood by silently as Vivian insulted his civil service career, but he was not going to stand by and watch her scream at his daughter. He stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared, his expression fierce. He had spent his entire life working double shifts to protect me, and he was not about to stop now. "That is enough," Elijah said, his deep voice booming with authority. "You will not disrespect my daughter in her own home. If she told you to leave, then you need to leave right now before I escort you out myself." My mother, Brenda, stepped up right beside him, her posture rigid. "We worked 15 years to build this life for Zora," she added, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "You have no right to come in here and act like you own what we bled for." Trent laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Oh, please," he sneered, stepping in front of Julian. "You two worked blue-collar jobs for 30 years. You probably pooled your retirement just to cover the closing costs on a place like this. You have absolutely no idea how real wealth operates. Julian is the only reason this mortgage will not default by Christmas. You should be thanking us for taking over the financial burden." My parents braced themselves, ready to tear into Trent and Vivian, but I immediately stepped between them. I held up my hand, pressing it gently against my father's chest. I caught his eye and gave him a subtle, reassuring nod. I did not need them fighting this battle. I did not need them lowering themselves to trade insults with people who were entirely beneath them. My parents had already done their job. They had secured my future. Now it was my turn to protect them. I turned my back on my parents and faced the mob of my in-laws. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Power does not need to shout to be heard. "I told you to leave Vivian," I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I am not going to ask you again." Vivian glared at me, her chest heaving with exertion. She looked around the room, realizing that her grand display of dominance had backfired. Her high society friends were whispering among themselves, their eyes darting away when she tried to look at them. She had attempted a public coup, and I had completely neutralized her. She snatched her designer purse off the entryway table, her hands shaking with fury. She marched toward the heavy oak front doors, her heels striking the floor like hammer blows. Right before she crossed the threshold, she spun around, pointing that manicured finger at me one last time. "You are going to regret this, Zora," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You do not humiliate an Atlanta socialite and get away with it. We are going to take this house, we are going to take every dime you have, and we are going to leave you and your parents with absolutely nothing. Mark my words." The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind Vivian, vibrating the crystal chandelier above our heads. That sound acted as a starting gun for the rest of the room. The wealthy socialites, the local politicians, and the country club gossips, who had happily drank my champagne all evening, suddenly found reasons to rush toward the exits. They whispered behind their hands, casting sideways glances at me as they scurried out into the warm Georgia night. The catering staff took one look at the tension radiating through the room and silently packed up their silver trays, vanishing through the servants' entrance. Within 10 minutes, the massive foyer was completely empty except for my parents, Julian, and me. My father took a step toward Julian, his fists clenched tight at his sides, but I gently placed my hand on his shoulder. I told my parents to go upstairs to their suite and rest. I promised them I had everything completely under control. My mother looked at me with deep concern, but she saw the absolute certainty in my eyes. She took my father's arm and led him away, leaving me entirely alone with the man I had married. The second my parents were out of sight, Julian's polished corporate facade disintegrated. He crossed the hardwood floor in 3 long strides and grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug painfully into my skin, a physical threat meant to remind me of my place. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Julian hissed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You just humiliated me in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. You made me look like I have no control over my own wife." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm and then up at his furious face. I did not struggle. I did not pull away. I let him feel like the big, strong executive he so desperately pretended to be. I asked him if he thought trying to hand over my home to his mother was supposed to make me respect him. Julian scoffed his breath, smelling heavily of expensive bourbon and cheap entitlement. "Your home?" he mocked, squeezing my arm tighter. "You mean the house your parents bought by draining their pathetic little civil service pensions? You think because your name is on a piece of paper that you run things here, Zora. You are an administrative consultant. You push papers for a living. I am the one bringing in the real money. I am the one with the network that keeps us relevant in this city. You need me to survive in this neighborhood." It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to laugh directly in his face. Julian actually believed his own lies. He actually thought his mid-level management salary was funding our lifestyle. He was completely blind to the fact that my administrative consulting job was a carefully crafted cover story. He had no idea that I spent my days brokering multi-million-dollar tech acquisitions, or that my holding company was currently the only reason his bank accounts had not been frozen. He leaned in closer, his eyes dark and menacing. "My mother is moving into the master wing, Zora. That is not a request. That is a reality. She is a legacy member of this community, and she deserves a space that reflects her status. You and your parents are going to clear out that wing, and you are going to do it with a smile on your faces." I kept my breathing steady, maintaining eye contact. "And what if I say no?" I asked softly. Julian's grip tightened one last time before he shoved my arm away in disgust. He took a step back, surveying the grand foyer with a look of absolute ownership. "If that master wing is not completely cleared out by next Friday, I am going to buy a box of heavy-duty garbage bags," Julian stated, his tone chillingly casual. "I will walk into those rooms and I will personally pack up every piece of cheap junk your parents brought into this house. That antique clock your father loves, the ugly hand-carved dining set your grandfather made. I will bag it all up and throw it on the curb where it belongs. And if you try to stop me, I will make sure everyone in this city knows exactly how unstable and ungrateful you truly are." He stood there waiting for the tears. He waited for me to crumble, to beg him not to throw away my family's heritage. He expected the quiet, submissive wife to apologize for stepping out of line. I slowly reached up and smoothed out the fabric of my sleeve where his fingers had just wrinkled it. I looked at the man I had spent the last 5 years of my life with. The entitlement radiating from him was palpable. He was so incredibly arrogant, so certain of his ultimate victory. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face, a lethal smile that did not reach my eyes. "I understand perfectly, Julian," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "You want the master wing completely cleared out. Consider it done. I will start packing first thing tomorrow morning." Julian smirked, clearly satisfied that he had broken my spirit. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and nodded, acting the part of the benevolent ruler who had just disciplined an unruly subject. He told me that was a smart decision and that he was glad I finally decided to join the real world. He turned on his heel and walked up the grand staircase, heading toward the guest room without looking back. I stood alone in the center of the foyer, the silence of the massive estate wrapping around me like a warm blanket. Julian walked away, feeling like a king who had just conquered a rebellious territory. But as I reached into my pocket and felt the sharp edges of the brass keys he had tried to give away, my smile widened. He had absolutely no idea that when I promised to start packing, it was not my belongings or my parents' belongings that I planned on boxing up. 2 days later, I drove my matte black sedan through the towering wrought iron gates of my property. The tires crunched softly against the pristine white gravel of the long, winding driveway. I had just returned from a 48-hour trip to New York. Julian firmly believed I was attending a mandatory administrative consulting seminar. He thought I was sitting in a fluorescent-lit hotel conference room, taking notes on office synergy and filing compliance. In reality, I had spent the last 2 days sitting in a sleek glass-walled boardroom in Lower Manhattan, finalizing the quarterly acquisition targets for my financial technology firm. I had also taken the liberty of transferring the deed of my Georgia estate into a heavily fortified corporate blind trust. I created a legal structure completely immune to marital asset claims or spousal overrides. I had built an invisible iron fortress around my property, ensuring Julian could never touch a single blade of grass on this land. As I rounded the final bend of the driveway, the serene beauty of the historic oaks and blooming magnolias was shattered by an absolute monstrosity. A massive bright yellow commercial moving truck was parked directly in the center of my circular driveway. The heavy metal rear ramp was fully extended, violently crushing the manicured edge of my prized rose bushes. A half-dozen burly movers in sweat-soaked uniforms were hauling heavy, awkward pieces of furniture out of the dark, cavernous back of the truck. I put my car in park and simply stared through the windshield at the sheer audacity unfolding on my front lawn. Vivian had wasted absolutely no time. She had apparently interpreted my promise to start packing as an immediate, unconditional surrender. The items being carried into my house were visually offensive. A horrific velvet Victorian sofa, the color of bruised plums, emerged first. Next came a massive gold-leafed mirror that looked like a prop from a cheap theater production. Then came several heavy wooden trunks that radiated the distinct smell of mothballs and stale lavender perfume even from a distance. Vivian's taste was exactly like her personality. Loud, gaudy, and desperately trying to appear more valuable than it actually was. Standing at the base of the grand front steps was Trent. He was wearing a pastel pink polo shirt and holding a plastic clipboard, acting like the supreme commander of a major military logistics operation. He pointed his expensive pen at the movers, barking aggressive, condescending orders at men who were performing back-breaking labor in the Georgia heat. He yelled at a young guy struggling with a massive oak armoire, telling him to watch the doorframes because the estate was historic and the movers probably could not afford to replace a single splinter of wood on their pathetic hourly wages. Trent reveled in the opportunity to demean working-class men while simultaneously playing the savior for his mother-in-law. He was carving up the square footage of my home in his head, probably already planning where to mount his flat-screen television in the guest house. Then my eyes shifted to the wraparound porch. Julian was lounging in a woven wicker rocking chair, his feet propped up disrespectfully on the pristine white railing. He was wearing designer sunglasses and puffing on a thick, cheap cigar he probably thought looked incredibly masculine. The noxious gray smoke drifted through the warm afternoon air, polluting the delicate scent of the gardens my parents had painstakingly restored. Julian looked like a newly crowned king surveying his conquered lands. He looked so incredibly pleased with himself. He honestly believed his little ultimatum 2 nights ago had broken me. He thought the threat of throwing my parents' cherished heirlooms on the curb in garbage bags had forced the quiet administrative assistant he married to submit to his absolute authority. I turned off the ignition. The engine cut out, leaving only the sound of Trent yelling at a mover and the heavy thud of boots on my porch steps. I did not feel the blind panic Julian wanted me to feel. I did not feel the desperate urge to cry or beg for mercy. I felt the cold, calculating precision of a shadow CEO about to liquidate a hostile takeover. I grabbed my handbag, opened the car door, and stepped out into the humid air. The sharp click of my stilettos on the pavement immediately drew Trent's attention. He paused mid-shout, lowering his clipboard. A smug, satisfied grin spread across his face as he watched me approach. He probably expected me to be carrying a cardboard box full of my parents' belongings out to my car. He probably expected me to ask for permission to enter my own house. Julian noticed me a moment later. He took a long, arrogant drag from his cigar and blew a thick cloud of smoke over the railing. He did not bother to stand up or greet me properly. He just smirked, leaning back in the chair, and gestured toward the moving truck with his cigar. Glad you are back, Zora. Julian called out, his voice dripping with smug condescension. You are just in time. Mother decided to get a head start since you promised to clear out the master wing. Trent and I took the liberty of directing the movers, while you were off pushing papers at your little seminar. I hope your parents have their boxes ready, because this truck needs to be unloaded by sundown, and I want them out of that wing tonight. I ignored him completely. I did not even look in his direction. I kept my eyes locked on the front doors of my estate, where a breathless mover was currently struggling to carry a hideous vintage chaise lounge upholstered in faded floral fabric. The piece of furniture was massive, and the mover was leaning backward, trying to balance the awkward weight as he approached the marble threshold of my grand foyer. I increased my pace, cutting directly across the pristine lawn, and stepped smoothly onto the porch. I walked straight past Julian, completely ignoring the cloud of foul cigar smoke, and positioned myself dead center in the middle of the double doorways. I stood like a stone statue, blocking the entrance entirely. The mover halted, his face flushed red and dripping with sweat. He looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes, shifting the heavy weight of the chaise lounge against his chest. He glanced nervously at Trent, down on the driveway, and then back at me, clearly unsure of who was actually in charge of this circus. "Excuse me, ma'am." The mover grunted, his arms shaking slightly under the strain. "I need to get this into the master suite on the first floor. The guy with the clipboard said it goes straight down the main hall and to the left." I looked at the heavy wooden legs of the chaise lounge, hovering just inches away from my polished custom marble floors. I looked into the eyes of the exhausted worker and spoke with a voice that carried the absolute lethal authority of a woman who owned every single brick on the property. "Drop it," I commanded. The mover blinked, sweat stinging his eyes. "Excuse me, ma'am," he stammered, his grip slipping slightly on the fabric. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I said, "Drop it immediately. If that hideous piece of garbage touches my marble floor, I will personally ensure your moving company is sued into bankruptcy for property damage. Put it down exactly where you are standing right now." The tone of my voice left absolutely no room for negotiation. The mover recognized raw, unchecked authority when he heard it. He did not look back at Trent for confirmation. He simply let go. The heavy vintage chaise lounge slammed onto the porch floorboards, with a loud echoing crack splintering one of the ornate wooden legs and sending a thick cloud of ancient dust into the air. The sharp crack of the splitting wood echoed across the manicured lawn, silencing the cicadas and freezing everyone in their tracks. A thick cloud of ancient dust puffed into the humid Georgia air from the shattered leg of the vintage chaise lounge. The mover did not wait for another command. He wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his hand, muttered a rapid apology to the air, and practically sprinted back toward the open ramp of the yellow moving truck. Trent stared at the broken furniture, his mouth slightly open. The illusion of his absolute control had just been shattered as easily as the rotted wood on the porch floorboards. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his pastel pink shirt. He hated losing. He hated when women did not immediately bow to his manufactured authority. He took a deep breath, physically forcing his features to compose themselves into a mask of smug superiority. If intimidation was not going to work on the quiet administrative assistant, he would simply pivot to the weapon he used to bully everyone else in his life. Trent reached over to the wrought iron patio table where he had dumped his expensive leather satchel. He unbuckled the brass clasp and pulled out a thick stack of papers bound by a heavy black legal clip. He slapped the document aggressively against his open palm, the sharp smack cutting through the heavy silence of the afternoon. "You really think you are untouchable, do you not?" Zora, Trent said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He slowly descended the grand front steps, closing the distance between us, until he was standing on the gravel driveway just a few feet away. He held the legal document up like a holy relic, tapping the dense paragraphs of text with his expensive fountain pen. "You think because the deed originally cleared in your name that you can stand on that porch and dictate who enters this property." I did not move. I did not blink. I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting him dig his own grave. "Let me give you a free legal education." Trent continued, pacing back and forth in front of the porch steps. He spoke loudly, making sure the remaining movers loitering near the truck could hear every word of his grand performance. The state of Georgia operates under the doctrine of equitable distribution when it comes to marital assets. You see, Zora, it does not matter whose name was on the original paperwork. What matters is the commingling of funds. What matters is the massive financial contribution my brother-in-law has poured into this estate over the past 12 months. I watched Trent wave the thick stack of papers in my direction. He was so incredibly confident. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the zip code holding the ultimate trump card. Julian has been keeping meticulous records, Trent declared, puffing out his chest. We have the invoices, we have the contractor receipts. Julian personally funded the complete gut renovation of the chef's kitchen. He paid for the imported Italian marble countertops. He bankrolled the expansion of the master wing specifically so his mother would have a comfortable place to reside. Those extensive renovations were paid for by Julian's corporate bonuses. That constitutes a massive injection of marital capital into this property. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of Julian's lies wash over me. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place, illuminating exactly what my husband had been telling his family behind my back. Julian had claimed credit for the renovations. He had told Trent and Vivian and Camille that his mid-level corporate salary was funding the transformation of this historic estate. I thought about Julian's end-of-year bonus. It had been exactly $12,000 after taxes. He had spent every single cent of it leasing a ridiculous sports car he could not afford and buying custom-fitted golf clubs to impress his supervisors. He had never contributed a single dime to the upkeep or the renovation of this house. The imported Italian marble, the copper fixtures, the structural expansion of the master wing had all been entirely funded by Zenith Holdings, a blind shell corporation I created specifically to manage my personal real estate portfolio. I had quietly wired over $400,000 in untraceable cash to the general contractor over the span of 6 months. Julian had merely signed a single delivery clipboard for a shipment of imported tile because I had been on a conference call. He had taken that single signature and spun it into a magnificent delusion of financial dominance. Because of Julian's extensive financial investment, Trent continued, his voice rising in volume. This house is now legally classified as marital property. You have absolutely no legal standing to deny his mother residency in a wing that his money built. This document is a formal declaration of his equitable interest. You are completely out of your depth, Zora. You cannot paper push your way out of a binding financial precedent. A sharp grating sound interrupted Trent's legal grandstanding. Camille stepped forward from the shadow of the porch pillars. She was casually leaning against the white railing, holding a crystal nail file. She dragged the emery board back and forth across her manicured acrylics, the scraping noise loud and obnoxious in the quiet air. She blew the acrylic dust off her fingertips and looked at me with an expression of pure boredom. Honestly, Zora, this is getting exhausting, Camille sighed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. You are embarrassing yourself. Trent is a senior partner at his firm. You really think you can outsmart him with your little administrative consultant salary? Julian pays for the lifestyle you enjoy. He bought this property and he upgraded it. You are basically just a very lucky guest living in his kingdom. She pointed her nail file at the shattered chaise lounge resting on the floorboards. Vivian is moving in. Camille declared, her voice hardening into a vicious demand. The caterers for her welcome party are arriving on Tuesday. You have no legal right to stop her, and you certainly do not have the money to fight Trent in court. So stop throwing temper tantrums like a child and go open the doors for the movers. I slowly shifted my gaze away from Camille and Trent. I looked up at the porch where my husband was standing. Julian had retreated from the edge of the railing. He was standing near the massive oak front doors, partially hidden by the shadows of the awning. The arrogant smirk he had worn just 10 minutes earlier was completely gone. His posture was rigid, his shoulders hunched up toward his ears. He was gripping the unlit cigar in his hand so tightly his knuckles were white. He knew exactly what Trent was holding. He knew those contractor invoices and material receipts were completely fabricated or selectively printed to hide the origin of the funds. Julian had lied to his family about his wealth to preserve his fragile ego, and now his brother-in-law was weaponizing those lies in a high-stakes legal threat against me. I stared directly at Julian, waiting for him to speak. I gave him one final silent opportunity to be a man. I waited for him to step forward to admit to his family that he had not paid for a single square inch of this estate. I waited for him to call off his attack dog of a brother-in-law. Julian felt the heavy weight of my gaze. He slowly turned his head, meeting my eyes for a fraction of a second. I saw the raw, pathetic cowardice swimming in his pupils. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Instead of telling the truth, Julian broke eye contact. He looked down at the porch floorboards and offered a slow, deliberate nod, validating every single lie Trent had just spewed onto my driveway. He was going to let them use his fabricated financial contributions to legally bully me out of my own home. He was going to stand by in cowardly silence and watch them try to destroy me. The final thread of my marriage snapped clean in two. There was no grief. There was no heartbreak. There was only the icy, absolute certainty of what had to be done next. The hot Georgia sun beat down on the driveway, but the air on the porch felt as cold as a morgue. I looked at Julian standing there in his tailored suit, a man who had just sold out his wife to cover his own pathetic insecurities. The silence stretched tight as a wire. Trent smirked, waving his ridiculous stack of papers while Camille went back to filing her nails, her face twisted into a victorious pout. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the tears to fall, for my voice to shake, for me to surrender my sanctuary to their greed. Instead, I laughed. It started low in my chest and bubbled up into the humid afternoon air. A genuine bright sound that made the lead mover take a cautious step backward. Trent dropped his hand, his smug expression faltering into a scowl of confusion. Camille froze, the emery board slipping from her manicured fingers and clattering onto the wooden floorboards. Julian flinched as if I had struck him physically. I stepped over the splintered leg of the vintage chaise lounge and walked directly toward my husband. I did not stop until I was inches from his face. I could smell the stale cigar smoke clinging to his lapels and see a bead of nervous sweat sliding down his temple. You want to claim equitable distribution based on your financial contributions, Julian? I asked, my voice conversational and light. You want to stand on my porch in front of your sister, your brother-in-law, and a crew of hired professionals and claim that your corporate bonuses funded the renovation of this estate. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward Trent for support, but Trent was busy trying to maintain his authoritative posture. Let us talk about those renovations, I announced, turning slightly so my voice would carry across the lawn to where Trent was standing. I want to make sure we have the exact figures for your impending court case, Trent. The imported Italian marble for the chef's kitchen was $85,000. The structural framing and foundation expansion for the master wing was $120,000. The copper gutters, the custom hardwood floors, and the smart home integration added another $90,000. That is nearly $300,000 injected into this property in a span of 6 months. I turned my gaze back to Julian. I looked him up and down, taking in his expensive shoes and his designer watch. Tell me, Julian, how exactly did you pay for a $300,000 renovation when your year-end bonus was exactly $12,000 after taxes? I asked, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. How did you afford Italian marble when you are currently bleeding cash to keep your underwater luxury car rental business afloat? The color drained out of Julian's face so fast he looked physically ill. Down on the driveway, Trent's clipboard slipped in his grip. Camille whipped her head around, staring at her husband and her brother with wide, confused eyes. What car rental business? Camille demanded, her voice sharp. Trent, what is she talking about? I did not give Trent a chance to spin another lie. I kept my eyes locked on Julian, dismantling him piece by piece. Oh, did you forget to tell your sister? I asked, tilting my head in mock sympathy. Did you forget to mention the LLC you and Trent secretly formed 2 years ago? The one where you took out massive high-interest loans to purchase a fleet of depreciating assets. You have 2 Lamborghinis, an Aston Martin, and a Bentley currently sitting in a private garage downtown. You thought you could rent them out to athletes and rappers shooting music videos in Atlanta. You thought you were going to be a mogul. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. But athletes and rappers do not want to rent cars from a mid-level corporate manager and his pretentious brother-in-law. I continued my words, slicing through the heavy air. Your occupancy rate for the fleet is sitting at less than 10%. The insurance premiums alone are devouring your monthly income. I found the final repossession notice for the Aston Martin stuffed inside your golf bag last week, Julian. You are not pouring marital capital into my historic estate. You are quietly draining every single cent of your personal savings and maxing out your credit cards just to stop the bank from seizing your ridiculous toy cars. Trent took an aggressive step forward toward the porch steps, his face flushed a dark, angry red. "Shut your mouth, Zora," he barked. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are making up desperate lies to save your house." "I am making up lies," I repeated, turning my attention fully to Trent. I looked at the supposed hotshot attorney and smiled. "My firm acquires companies for a living, Trent. I track hidden assets, offshore accounts, and shell corporations before my morning coffee. Your little car rental business is registered under a generic holding name, but you used your home address for the tax documents. You are hemorrhaging money. You are drowning in debt. You came here today to force me out of my master wing because you thought you could use my property to collateralize a new loan for your failing business. You needed Julian to claim ownership so you could leverage my equity to save yourselves." Camille turned on Trent, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "Is this true?" she shrieked. "Tell me you did not leverage our house for those stupid cars, Trent." Trent ignored his wife, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it practically vibrated. Julian was staring at the floorboards, completely broken. He had tried to play the role of a wealthy patriarch, and I had just stripped him bare in front of an audience. I stepped closer to Julian, grabbing him roughly by the lapels of his expensive jacket. I gave him a sharp shake, forcing him to look at me. The movers were watching in stunned silence, the heavy furniture completely forgotten. "Look at me, Julian," I commanded, my voice echoing off the brick facade of the house. "I want you to tell the truth right now. I want you to tell your sister, your brother-in-law, and every single man standing on this driveway whose money paid for the floor you are currently standing on." He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head weakly. "Zora, please do not do this," he whispered. Say it." I demanded, my voice echoing like a gunshot. "Did you contribute a single dime to the renovation of this estate? Did you pay for the roof over your head?" The silence that followed was agonizing. The wind rustled through the magnolia trees, carrying the scent of impending rain. Julian's shoulders slumped forward, entirely defeated. He opened his eyes, looking at the ground, unable to meet the gaze of his sister, or the movers who were watching his ultimate humiliation. "No," Julian mumbled, his voice thick with shame. "Say it louder," I commanded, releasing his lapels and stepping back in disgust. "Make sure Trent hears you so he can update his little legal document." "I did not pay for any of it," Julian said, his voice breaking. "I have not contributed a single dime to this house. It is all yours." Camille let out a strangled sob, covering her mouth with her hands, as the reality of their financial ruin finally sank in. Julian sagged against the front door, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. I had forced him to publicly admit his absolute irrelevance. I had forced him to confess his fraud right in front of the people he had tried to impress. I turned my attention back to the driveway, expecting to see Trent retreating in shame. I expected him to pack up his clipboard, tell the movers to reload the truck, and drive away to deal with his furious wife and his failing car rental business. But I had underestimated the sheer depth of Trent's toxic arrogance. He did not back down. He simply stood there, his chest heaving, his knuckles white, as he gripped the stack of legal papers. A dark, vicious sneer spread across his face, replacing the shock with something far more dangerous. He looked at Julian with utter disgust, and then locked his cold eyes on me. "That was a cute little performance, Zora," Trent said, his voice dripping with malice. "A very entertaining attempt to change the subject. But unfortunately for you, verbal arguments and forced confessions on a front porch mean absolutely nothing in a court of law." He tapped the legal document aggressively against his thigh. I have the signed contractor invoices. I have the delivery receipts with Julian's signature on them. In the eyes of a judge, those papers establish a pattern of marital investment. Your little tantrum does not legally evict my mother-in-law from a property she has a rightful claim to. We are moving her in today, and you can cry about it to your divorce attorney on Monday. Trent turned his back to me, completely ignoring his sobbing wife. He looked at the line of exhausted movers who were still standing frozen on the driveway. "What are you idiots waiting for?" Trent barked, pointing his pen at the broken chaise lounge resting on my porch. "Pick that garbage up and carry it inside right now. We are moving this furniture into the master wing, and if she tries to block the door, you walk right through her. Keep moving." The lead mover froze his heavy work boots planted firmly on the top step of my porch. He looked at Trent, who was screaming orders from the driveway, his face a mask of purple rage, and then he looked at me, standing perfectly still, blocking the threshold. The mover was a large man, built from years of manual labor, but he clearly had no interest in being the physical battering ram for a wealthy family's domestic dispute. He took a slow, cautious half-step backward. I did not wait for Trent to escalate his fake authority. I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out my phone. I bypassed the lock screen and tapped 3 digits with absolute precision. I put the phone on speaker and held it up. The loud automated ringing echoed sharply across the lawn. On the second ring, a crisp, professional voice answered, "911 emergency, what is your location?" Julian's head snapped up, his eyes widening in pure horror. Camille let out a high-pitched gasp, grabbing her brother's arm. Trent stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as the reality of the ringing phone finally registered in his arrogant brain. "Yes, I need immediate assistance at my residence," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any panic. "I am the sole homeowner, and there is a hostile trespassing, an attempted home invasion currently in progress. I have an aggressive group of individuals led by a man named Trent, attempting to force unauthorized entry into my private estate with a commercial moving crew. They are threatening property damage, and I feel physically threatened. Ma'am, police units are being dispatched to your location right now," the operator replied, her tone shifting to high alert. "Are the individuals armed?" "Not to my knowledge," I answered, keeping my eyes locked on Trent. "But they are highly volatile and refusing to leave my property. Please hurry." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The lead mover did not need to hear another word. He looked at his crew down on the driveway and sharply whistled. "That is it, we are done here," he shouted. "Put it down, all of it. Drop it right now. We are not getting arrested for breaking and entering." The moving crew operated with incredible efficiency. They did not carefully wrap the items or gently lower them onto the pavement. They simply let go. A heavy oak dresser slammed into the manicured grass of my front lawn, tearing up chunks of sod. Vivian's gaudy velvet dining chairs were tossed carelessly onto the damp earth. The massive gold-leafed mirror tipped over and crashed onto the gravel driveway, the glass shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. The air filled with the sharp smell of fractured wood and the dull thud of heavy antique trunks hitting the dirt. Trent charged forward, waving his clipboard like a weapon. "What are you doing?" he shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You cannot leave this furniture out here. I am a senior partner at a major law firm. I hired you. I will sue your company into the ground. I will personally see to it that you never work in this city again." The lead mover jogged down the porch steps, completely ignoring Trent's unhinged threats. He signaled his men toward the truck. "Sue whoever you want, buddy," the mover yelled back over his shoulder. "I do not care who you are. I am not catching a felony charge for forcing my way into a house when the owner just called the cops. Mail a check for the hourly rate to our corporate office." The men scrambled into the cab of the massive yellow truck. The diesel engine roared to life, belching a thick cloud of black exhaust into the pristine air. The driver threw the truck into reverse, ignoring the circular path of the driveway entirely. He backed straight over Vivian's precious imported rose bushes, crushing them into green paste before throwing the truck into drive and speeding away through the wrought iron gates. Camille was hyperventilating, clinging to Trent's arm while he stood frozen, staring at the shattered mirror on the gravel. Julian was still backed against the wall of the porch, looking like a man who was about to physically be sick. Before anyone could formulate a response to the chaotic departure of the movers, the screech of tires echoed up the driveway. A sleek silver Mercedes-Benz tore through the open gates, kicking up a massive cloud of white dust. The car sped up the winding path and slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just inches behind Trent. The driver's side door flew open and Vivian stepped out. She was wearing a vibrant turquoise silk pantsuit and oversized designer sunglasses, expecting to arrive to a grand welcome. She expected to walk through my front doors and instantly assume her role as the matriarch of the estate. Instead, she pulled down her sunglasses and stared at the absolute wreckage of her life. She saw her priceless Victorian furniture dumped haplessly on the damp grass. She saw the shattered remains of her antique mirror glittering in the sunlight. She saw the broken chaise lounge resting on the porch floorboards. Vivian looked at her daughter, who was quietly sobbing, and then at her son, who was actively cowering in the shadows. Finally, her gaze snapped up to me. She let out a guttural sound that was half scream and half sob. She marched up the gravel walkway, her expensive heels sinking into the mud, and stopped right at the base of the porch steps. She pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my chest. "You have crossed the final line!" Zora, Vivian shrieked. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. "You think you have won because you scared off a few minimum wage workers. You think calling the police makes you powerful. I will destroy you for this. I will take this house, I will take this land, and I will take every single penny to your name. I will leave you and your pathetic blue-collar parents homeless and begging on the streets of Atlanta." Trent stepped up right beside her, finding his false courage again. He held up his useless legal document, crushing it in his fist. "You have no idea the hell you just unleashed." He spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I will bury you in litigation, Zora. I have judges on speed dial. By the time my firm is done tearing through your life, you will be legally and financially decimated. You just declared war on the wrong family." I looked down at them, taking in their flushed faces and their desperate screaming. I looked at Julian, who was still refusing to meet my eyes, choosing to stare at the ground, while his mother and brother-in-law threatened to destroy his wife. "The police are currently 3 minutes away," I said, my voice perfectly level, cutting through their hysterical screaming like a freshly sharpened blade. "When they arrive, they will find 2 individuals trespassing on private property, issuing verbal threats, and attempting to force illegal entry. I highly suggest you get into that Mercedes and drive away before I have you both removed from my estate in handcuffs." Vivian opened her mouth to scream another insult, but the distant wail of police sirens suddenly cut through the humid Georgia air. The sound was faint, but growing louder by the second. The color instantly drained from Vivian's face. The reality of standing in a driveway surrounded by dumped furniture while police cruisers approached finally penetrated her delusion. Trent swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the main road. He knew perfectly well that his fabricated legal document would not stop a police officer from arresting him for trespassing. I did not wait to see them scramble into their cars. I turned my back on them and walked through the grand double doors of my home. I grabbed the heavy brass handles and pulled the oak doors shut. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a loud, echoing click, sealing the hostility outside and wrapping me in the absolute silence of my sanctuary. I stood in the foyer for a brief moment, letting the quiet wash over me. The air was cool and smelled of fresh lilies and polished wood. I took a deep breath, centering my focus. The emotional games were officially over. The time for warnings had passed. I walked past the grand staircase and headed straight down the long corridor toward my private study. It was a room Julian rarely entered, intimidated by the walls lined with dense financial texts and the dual monitor setup I used to manage my empire. I stepped inside the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, sealing me inside my command center. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. I reached past the neat stacks of corporate filings and pulled out a sleek, encrypted satellite phone. It was a device completely detached from any network Julian or his family could ever hope to access. I bypassed the biometric security protocols and dialed a direct unlisted line to my primary wealth manager in Geneva. The line clicked, connecting on the very first ring. "Good afternoon, madam," the crisp voice of my manager echoed through the secure line. I looked out the large bay window of my study, watching the silver Mercedes and Trent's luxury SUV hastily speeding down the driveway to escape the approaching police cruisers. I watched them drive away, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was about to rain down upon their lives. "It is time," I said, my voice cold, precise, and completely devoid of mercy. "Initiate Protocol Alpha." The secure line disconnected with a soft click, leaving my study in absolute silence. I placed the encrypted satellite phone back into the bottom drawer, turned the key, and slipped it into my pocket. Outside my bay window, the flashing blue and red lights of 2 Atlanta police cruisers cut through the fading afternoon light. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts as they surveyed the shattered antique mirror and the ruined velvet chairs littering my front lawn. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, walked out of my study, and opened the front doors to greet them. I gave the officers a polite, perfectly composed statement. I explained that a moving company had arrived at my property uninvited, directed by estranged family members, attempting to force an illegal eviction. I provided Trent and Vivian's license plate numbers, which I had memorized instantly, and requested a formal incident report for property damage regarding my destroyed rose bushes. The officers were incredibly respectful. They took notes, handed me a card with a case number, and assured me that patrol cars would monitor the street for the rest of the night. By the time they pulled away, the estate was locked down tight. My parents were safe upstairs, completely unaware of the absolute chaos I had just dismantled on the front porch. For 24 hours, there was nothing but a heavy, suffocating silence. Julian did not come back. He did not call. He did not text. He was hiding. But I knew the silence was merely the ocean pulling back before a massive tsunami. Vivian was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a woman who burned down entire cities when she did not get her way. If she could not take my house by force, she was going to take my reputation, my community, and my standing in Atlanta society. The assault began early Sunday morning. My phone vibrated on the marble kitchen island while I was pouring my morning coffee. It was a text message from a woman I had known for 3 years, a fellow board member on a local arts charity. The message read simply, "I am praying that God softens your heart, Zora. Julian does not deserve this." I set my coffee mug down. I picked up the phone and watched as a second message arrived from my tennis partner at the country club. "How could you do that to him? He gave you everything. Do not ever contact me again." Within an hour, my notification screen was a relentless waterfall of judgment, disgust, and outright hatred. Vivian had gone on a highly calculated, deeply vicious offensive. She had weaponized the 2 most powerful social networks in affluent Black Atlanta: her elite sorority alumnae chapter and her massive 10,000-member megachurch. Vivian had not just spread a rumor, she had orchestrated a masterclass in character assassination. She played the role of the devastated, fiercely protective mother to absolute perfection. She started by submitting a public prayer request to the senior pastoral staff at her megachurch. She asked the congregation to pray for her son Julian, who was currently suffering from severe emotional and financial abuse at the hands of his wife. She painted Julian as a hardworking, generous provider who was being systematically drained of his resources by a cold, calculating narcissist. Once the church gossip mill was primed, she activated her sorority network. Vivian called every influential woman she knew: judges, city councilwomen, hospital administrators, and charity chairs. She told them a story that was so outrageously fabricated it bordered on sociopathic. She claimed that I was a gold digger who had trapped Julian in a loveless marriage purely to extract his wealth. She told them that my administrative consulting job was a pathetic lie, and that I actually sat at home all day spending Julian's hard-earned corporate salary on designer shoes and secret bank accounts. But Vivian did not stop at attacking me. She knew that to truly isolate me, she had to destroy the people I loved most. The text messages flooding my phone began to take a much darker, more sinister turn. Vivian had pivoted her attack toward my parents. She was actively telling the upper echelons of Atlanta society that Elijah and Brenda were not innocent retired civil servants. She was spreading the vicious lie that my parents were seasoned grifters. Vivian claimed that my parents had scammed Julian out of his entire life savings to secure the deed to the historic estate. She told everyone that my father had used his old government connections to forge the property documents putting the house in my name, to ensure Julian was left with absolutely nothing. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. My parents, who had worked 40 years in public schools and city planning, who had saved every penny to buy this property, were being painted as criminal masterminds who had robbed a helpless mid-level corporate manager. The social ostracization was immediate and absolute. I received an automated email from the country club informing me that my membership privileges had been temporarily suspended, pending a board review of my moral conduct. The chairwoman of the arts charity sent a brief, cold message demanding my immediate resignation from the board, citing a misalignment of values. Women I had hosted for dinner in this very house, women who had drank my wine and complimented my chef's kitchen, were now publicly blocking me on social media. I was completely exiled. In the span of 48 hours, Vivian had successfully turned me into a social pariah. She had stripped away my community, my network, and my pristine reputation. She expected me to break. She expected me to react with the frantic, desperate energy of a woman watching her life burn down. She wanted me to log onto Facebook and type out a massive weeping defense. She wanted me to go on Instagram Live crying and begging people to believe my side of the story. She wanted me to call Julian pleading with him to stop his mother from destroying me. Vivian thrived on the frantic flailing of her victims. I did none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. I did not type a single defensive reply to the hundreds of vile text messages sitting in my inbox. I simply put my phone on silent mode and walked away from the kitchen island. I walked down the long, quiet corridor of the estate and stepped into my study. The heavy oak door sealed the room, insulating me in my private command center. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and woke up my dual monitors. The screens flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a cool blue light. I was not interested in fighting a public relations war with a group of country club gossips. Let them talk. Let them pray for Julian. Let them believe Vivian's pathetic fairy tale. While Vivian was busy running her mouth to the church choir, she had completely ignored the fatal flaw in her strategy. She thought I was an administrative assistant. She had absolutely no idea who she had just picked a fight with. I opened a secure encrypted terminal on my left monitor. Protocol Alpha was not just a defensive maneuver to lock down my real estate assets. It was an aggressive, highly invasive financial surveillance protocol. When I made that call to Geneva, my wealth manager had instantly deployed a team of forensic accountants to quietly infiltrate the public and private digital footprints of Trent, Julian, and Vivian. I watched the data stream across my screen in real time. I saw Trent's business banking accounts hemorrhaging cash to cover the massive insurance premiums on his fleet of unrented luxury cars. I saw the desperate high-interest bridge loans he had taken out just 3 days ago using Vivian's own residential property as collateral without her knowledge. I saw Julian's credit card statements maxed out to the absolute limit from buying expensive dinners and renting VIP sections at clubs to maintain his illusion of wealth. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers together as I watched the numbers align perfectly. Vivian was out there screaming to anyone who would listen that I was a financial predator stealing Julian's millions. She was wrapping a noose of public attention around her own neck. She was demanding that the entire city look closely at Julian's finances. I smiled a slow, lethal smile in the quiet darkness of my study. I watched the financial trap I had set fall perfectly into place. Vivian wanted a public spectacle regarding stolen money. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for, but the millions of dollars missing were not going to belong to Julian. 72 hours after Vivian launched her digital crusade, my home remained an impenetrable, quiet fortress. The relentless pinging of my phone had finally ceased once I blocked the numbers of every single country club associate and church committee member who felt entitled to weigh in on my marriage. The outside world believed I was cowering in my living room, completely devastated by my sudden exile from Atlanta society. They thought I was a broken woman crying over lost invitations to charity galas and sorority luncheons. In reality, I was sitting comfortably at my kitchen island, drinking a perfectly brewed cup of espresso and reviewing the staggering volume of financial intelligence my team in Geneva was feeding to my encrypted tablet. The data was a beautiful, catastrophic masterpiece. I mapped out the exact flow of Julian and Trent's financial ruin. I watched them shift money from one overdrawn account to another, desperately trying to keep their fraudulent luxury car rental business from triggering a federal audit. Trent had even forged Vivian's signature to take out a second mortgage on her pristine suburban home. They were drowning in a sea of toxic debt, and they were looking for a life raft. My historic estate was the only unencumbered asset left in their entire orbit. The heavy thud of the front door opening shattered the peaceful silence of the house. I did not flinch. I took a slow sip of my espresso and turned my head just as Julian strode into the kitchen. He did not look like the humiliated coward who had slinked away from my porch 3 days ago. He looked completely revitalized, radiating a toxic, aggressive energy. He had traded his usual tailored corporate suit for a sleek black leather jacket and dark denim, acting like a man who had just won a major victory. The arrogance practically rolled off him in waves. He walked directly to the marble island and slammed a thick, heavy stack of legal documents onto the counter. The sharp smack echoed through the large kitchen. The paperwork was bound in premium navy blue cardstock, embossed with the gold foil logo of Trent's prestigious Midtown law firm. Julian did not say a word. He bypassed me, completely walked over to the custom wet bar built into the far wall, and poured himself 3 fingers of my most expensive aged scotch. He took a long, appreciative sip, letting the silence stretch out to maximize his perceived intimidation. "Go ahead and read it," Julian finally said, turning around to lean against the wet bar. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Trent and his senior partners worked very hard on it all weekend. I figured since you are suddenly so fond of legal boundaries, you would appreciate the formal paperwork." I set my espresso cup down and reached for the heavy file. I flipped open the navy cover and scanned the first page. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage. But it was not a standard divorce filing. It was a highly aggressive, viciously calculated declaration of war. Trent had drafted a masterpiece of legal fiction. The documents accused me of gross financial infidelity. They claimed that I had systematically siphoned marital assets into offshore accounts with the explicit help of my parents. The petition demanded that my name be immediately struck from the deed of the Georgia estate and replaced solely with Julian's name as compensation for the supposed fraud. It did not stop there. The paperwork formally requested exorbitant permanent spousal support, claiming that Julian had sacrificed his own lucrative earning potential to support my administrative career. I slowly turned the heavy pages, my eyes tracing the absolute absurdity of their demands. Trent was requesting an emergency injunction to freeze my parents' modest civil service pensions, claiming that Elijah and Brenda had acted as criminal accomplices in stealing Julian's wealth. They were threatening to depose my mother and father to drag 2 elderly public servants through a grueling, humiliating public trial. "You see, Zora, you played your hand terribly," Julian said, his voice dripping with triumphant condescension. "You thought locking the doors and calling the cops made you untouchable. You forgot who you are dealing with. My mother has already exposed you to the entire city. Everyone knows exactly what you and your grifter parents did to me. You have no friends left in this town. You have no community. You do not even have a country club membership anymore." Julian took another sip of his scotch, pushing away from the bar and slowly pacing across the kitchen floor. He looked at the legal documents resting under my hands and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Trent practically wrote a blank check with this filing," Julian continued, gesturing to the papers. "He mathematically structured this divorce to completely bankrupt your family. We are going to drag your parents into depositions for months. We are going to subpoena their bank records, their retirement accounts, and the deed to their little townhouse. By the time Trent's firm is done billing you for legal fees, your parents will not even be able to afford their groceries, let alone a defense attorney." I looked up from the paperwork and met Julian's eyes. He was searching my face for panic. He desperately wanted to see my hands shake. He wanted me to beg him to leave my parents out of it. He honestly believed that the threat of financial ruin would force me to surrender the house just to protect my mother and father from the stress of a public trial. "What exactly are your terms, Julian?" I asked, my voice perfectly flat, betraying absolutely zero emotion. Julian's smug smile widened. He thought my calm demeanor was the quiet resignation of a defeated woman. "It is very simple, Zora," he said, walking closer to the island. "You sign that paperwork exactly as it is written. You relinquish your claim to this estate and transfer the deed fully into my name. You walk away with whatever you have in your little checking account, and you disappear. If you do that, I will tell Trent to drop the financial fraud allegations against your parents. They get to keep their pathetic pensions, and you get to walk away without a felony charge." Julian actually believed his own leverage. He was standing in my kitchen drinking my scotch, threatening to ruin my parents based on fabricated legal documents designed by a lawyer who was secretly bankrupting his own family. The sheer scale of his delusion was almost impressive. He thought the social isolation orchestrated by his mother had stripped me of my resources. He thought the administrative consultant he married could not afford the retainer fee for a junior defense attorney, let alone fight a senior partner like Trent in court. I looked down at the signature line on the final page of the petition. I felt the sharp edges of the encrypted tablet resting in my pocket, the device holding the exact coordinates of Julian's financial grave. "I understand your position, Julian," I said smoothly, closing the heavy navy cover of the document. "You want the house in exchange for my parents' peace of mind. You want me to surrender." Julian closed the remaining distance between us. He set his crystal glass down on the marble counter with a sharp clink. He did not stop walking until he was standing directly in front of me. He stepped deeply into my personal space, raising his arms to place his hands flat on the edge of the marble island, effectively trapping me between his body and the counter. The polished, sophisticated corporate mask he wore for the world completely melted away. His features twisted into a dark, ugly sneer, revealing the greedy, predatory monster that had been lurking beneath his tailored suits for 5 years. He leaned in so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "This is not a negotiation," Zora Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing whisper. "You are going to sign those papers, and you are going to pack your bags tonight. You played a stupid game, and you lost. If you try to fight me on this, if you try to drag this into a courtroom, I swear to God, I will let Trent unleash hell on your parents. I will watch his firm take everything they have worked for, and I will laugh while they lose their home. You have 48 hours to sign that paper. Do not test me because you have absolutely nothing left to fight with." Julian held me pinned against the cold marble of the kitchen island, his breathing heavy and erratic. For a long, agonizing moment, he let his threat hang in the silent air. He wanted me to feel the full crushing weight of his absolute authority. He wanted to watch the administrative consultant he had belittled for 5 years completely shatter under the prospect of her parents being dragged into a courtroom and stripped of their life savings. But then Julian shifted his tactic. The aggressive cornering, the physical intimidation, and the harsh whispering had set the stage. Now it was time for the performance he loved most. He slowly pushed himself off the edge of the marble counter and took a deliberate step backward. He smoothed the lapels of his leather jacket and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. His facial expression morphed instantly. The vicious, predatory sneer vanished, replaced by a look of deep, profound pity. He sighed heavily, shaking his head like a disappointed father dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "Zora, it truly does not have to be this ugly," Julian said, his voice dropping into a soft, soothing register. The sudden shift was jarring, a classic psychological manipulation tactic designed to cause emotional whiplash. I looked at him, keeping my face completely blank, as he began to pace slowly across the kitchen floor. "I loved you once," Zora Julian continued, his tone dripping with manufactured sorrow. "I really did. And because I loved you, I am trying to protect you from the reality of what my brother-in-law is capable of doing. Trent is a shark. His law firm destroys people for sport. When I told him you were refusing to let my mother move into the master wing, he was ready to file injunctions that would have frozen your parents' pension accounts by tomorrow morning. He wanted to send process servers to their townhouse tonight. Julian stopped pacing and looked at me with wide, earnest eyes. He was playing the benevolent savior, standing between me and the ruthless legal machine he had personally unleashed. I begged him to hold off. Julian lied, his voice thick with fake sincerity. I told Trent that you were just emotional. I told him that you did not understand the legal gravity of the situation. I held him back, Zora, because I do not want to see Elijah and Brenda destroyed. Your parents are simple, hardworking people. They do not understand corporate litigation or equitable distribution. If Trent drags them into a deposition room, he will confuse them, trap them in a lie, and legally seize every single asset they own. They will lose their retirement. They will lose their home. All because you are being stubborn over a piece of real estate. He walked back to the custom wet bar and picked up his glass of scotch, swirling the amber liquid. He took a slow sip, letting the terrifying picture he had just painted settle into my mind. He was using my deep love for my parents as a weapon, twisting it into a suffocating pressure meant to force my compliance. But I am offering you a generous way out, Julian said, stepping back toward the island and gesturing to the thick navy blue legal document resting on the marble. I am giving you a lifeline, Zora. If you just sign this paperwork today, if you quietly transfer the deed into my name and allow my mother to take her rightful place in this house, I will call Trent off. I will personally guarantee that he drops the financial fraud allegations against your parents. Julian leaned against the counter, offering me a warm, reassuring smile that made my skin crawl. You can pack your things and walk away clean, Julian offered, his voice smooth as silk. I will not come after your personal checking account. I will let you keep whatever little savings you have from your administrative job. You can start over somewhere else, and your parents will never have to face the humiliation of a public trial. You do not want to fight this, Zora. You do not have the money, the stamina, or the intellect to survive a legal war with my family. Just sign the paper and I will let you walk away in peace. I stared at the thick stack of papers. Julian was completely delusional. He was offering me the privilege of surrendering my multi-million-dollar historic estate to cover his catastrophic debts, disguised as a merciful gift. He honestly believed his psychological warfare had worked. He needed this signature today, because without this house, he had absolutely zero collateral to save his failing luxury car rental business from impending federal bankruptcy. I knew exactly what I had to do. Protocol Alpha was already running in the background, but my financial team in Geneva needed time to systematically lock down the trap. I could not alert Julian to the fact that I was tracking his offshore accounts and shell companies. I needed him to feel utterly victorious. I needed him to drop his guard completely. I forced my breathing to hitch. I dropped my gaze to the floor, letting my shoulders slump forward in a posture of absolute defeat. I squeezed my eyes shut physically, forcing a violent tremor into my hands as I reached out and touched the edge of the navy blue folder. I let a sharp, ragged gasp escape my lips. Julian, please, I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. I sounded incredibly small, fragile, and thoroughly terrified. I brought my trembling hands up to cover my face, hiding the lethal cold smile that threatened to break my performance. I forced myself to shake, burying my face in my palms, acting like a woman whose entire spirit had just been crushed under the weight of his manipulation. Please, do not do this to my parents, I sobbed, forcing tears into the corners of my eyes. They have nothing to do with this. They worked their whole lives for those pensions, Julian. You cannot let Trent take their home. Julian's posture instantly shifted. The sight of my tears was like a potent drug to his narcissistic ego. He took a step closer, his chest puffing out with supreme satisfaction. He had broken me. The quiet little administrative assistant was finally begging for his mercy. I am trying to stop him, Zora, Julian said softly, reaching out and patting my shoulder with disgusting condescension. But you have to work with me. You have to sign the document. I peeked through my trembling fingers, looking at the terrifying stack of legal papers with wide, fearful eyes. I cannot just sign it blindly, Julian. I whimpered, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. I do not understand any of this legal terminology. Trent uses all these massive words and clauses. What if he puts something in there that hurts my parents anyway? What if this is a trick to take their pensions even after I give you the house? I let out another ragged sob, shaking my head frantically. I just need a little bit of time, Julian, I begged, looking up at him with utter desperation. Please, just give me a few days to read it over. I will find a cheap, small-time lawyer down the street. Someone who just charges a tiny hourly consultation fee to translate this for me. I just need a basic attorney to confirm that my parents are legally shielded from Trent if I sign over the deed. I deliberately insulted my own capacity to fight back. I painted myself as a pathetic broke woman looking for a strip mall lawyer just to read a document. I made myself completely harmless. Julian stared at me, his eyes gleaming with absolute victory. He looked at my tear-stained face and my trembling hands, and he bought every single second of the performance. He genuinely believed I was broken. He believed that he had successfully terrified me into handing over my fortune to save my parents from a fabricated threat. He let out a short, arrogant chuckle. He picked up his scotch glass and took a final triumphant sip. Fine, Julian said, his voice dripping with supreme arrogance. You can have someone read it. Go find your little discount lawyer, Zora. Let them tell you exactly how airtight Trent's filing is. Let them confirm that you have absolutely no way out of this. He set the empty crystal glass down on the counter and adjusted the cuffs of his leather jacket. But do not test my patience, Zora, Julian warned, pointing a firm finger at the documents. You have until Friday. If that signature line is blank by Friday afternoon, I am calling Trent and telling him to freeze your parents' accounts. Enjoy your cheap legal consultation. Julian turned on his heel and walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps echoing loudly down the hallway. He felt like an absolute god. He left the house convinced he had just secured a multi-million-dollar asset and saved himself from financial ruin simply by intimidating his weak wife. I listened to the heavy thud of the front door closing. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. The trembling stopped instantly. The fake tears dried on my cheeks. The posture of a defeated, terrified woman vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating stillness of an apex predator. I looked down at Trent's ridiculous legal filing resting on the marble island. Julian thought he had granted me a merciful extension. He had absolutely no idea that he had just given me exactly what I needed. By Friday afternoon, he would not be receiving a signed deed. He would be receiving the full, devastating force of the digital guillotine swinging down to sever his entire life. The heavy thud of the front oak door slamming shut echoed through the grand foyer, followed by the faint, aggressive roar of Julian's car engine speeding down the long driveway. The moment the sound completely vanished into the humid Georgia evening, my violently trembling hands went perfectly still. I lowered them from my face and stood up straight. The terrified, fragile posture of a defeated wife evaporated into the cool, conditioned air of the kitchen, leaving behind nothing but cold, absolute clarity. I reached up and wiped a single manufactured tear from my cheek, my breathing returning to a slow, steady rhythm. I looked down at the thick navy blue legal document sitting on the marble island. Julian genuinely thought he had won. He believed with his entire mediocre soul that he had successfully broken me using a boilerplate intimidation tactic and a stack of fabricated threats. I let out a short, humorless laugh, grabbed the heavy file, and walked straight back down the corridor toward my study. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and stepped into the dark, quiet sanctuary of my command center. The encrypted terminal on my massive mahogany desk was already glowing with new incoming data streams, painting the room in a sharp blue light. I bypassed the biometric security lock and initiated a secure video link to my primary wealth manager in Geneva. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second before Marcus appeared sitting in his pristine glass-walled office overlooking Lake Geneva. He looked perfectly composed, an intricate spreadsheet glowing on his own monitor. "Good evening, Madam Marcus," said his voice crisp and strictly professional. "Protocol Alpha has successfully isolated all target assets. The deep financial sweep on the subjects is completely finalized. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, tossing Trent's ridiculous divorce petition onto the desk. "Tell me everything, Marcus," I said, my eyes tracking the cascading numbers on my secondary monitor. "Show me exactly how desperate they are." "It is substantially worse than our initial projections indicated." He began pulling up a series of complex financial flowcharts that mapped out a web of shell companies. Julian and his brother-in-law, Trent, have been operating a luxury car rental business called Apex Exotics for the past 3 years. It is fundamentally functioning as a massive financial black hole. They have been leasing Lamborghinis and Bentleys to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth, but they could not cover the exorbitant overhead insurance premiums and depreciation costs. The business has been functionally insolvent for 8 months, bleeding over $80,000 every 30 days. I nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Julian's absolute desperation in the kitchen made perfect sense now. He did not want this house to spite me. He needed this house to liquidate it. But bridge loans of that magnitude require substantial collateral, I noted, leaning forward. What exactly did Trent leverage to secure the cash to keep a sinking business afloat for nearly a year? Marcus leaned into the camera, a rare hint of dark amusement crossing his usually stoic expression. "That is the most fascinating revelation of the entire sweep," he said. "Trent did not use his own assets, and he certainly did not use Julian's. He exploited his position as the trusted attorney of the family. Trent forged power of attorney documents and secretly leveraged his mother-in-law Vivian's entire retirement portfolio." I stared at the screen, processing the sheer audacity of the crime. "When the retirement funds were not enough to stop the bleeding," Marcus continued, "Trent quietly took out a massive second mortgage on Vivian's primary residential estate in Buckhead. Vivian's luxury home, her entire life savings, and her investment portfolios are currently collateralized against $4.2 million of toxic underwater business loans." I sat in absolute stunned silence, letting the magnitude of Trent's betrayal wash over me. Vivian was running all over Atlanta, spreading vicious rumors that I was a gold digger, financially abusing her son. She was weaponizing her church and her sorority to destroy my reputation, while her own golden son-in-law had secretly mortgaged her entire existence. She was screaming about my supposed crimes, completely blind to the fact that her own pristine mansion had been sold right out from under her custom designer heels. She thought she was an untouchable matriarch, but she was actually millions of dollars in predatory debt. "Who holds the paper, Marcus?" I asked, my heart beginning to beat with a slow, rhythmic anticipation. "Who owns the debt on Vivian's house?" Marcus typed a few rapid commands into his keyboard, and a new highly classified document appeared on my primary screen. "That is the absolute poetic justice of this entire operation, madam," he replied, his tone laced with profound respect. "The original predatory lender bundled those toxic loans when they realized Apex Exotics was failing. They sold the debt portfolio off to a larger international acquisitions firm 90 days ago for pennies on the dollar. They were purchased by Vanguard Financial Solutions." I looked at the name of the holding company boldly printed at the top of the digital document. Vanguard Financial Solutions was a shadow subsidiary of my own fintech empire. I had built the firm 3 years ago specifically to acquire and manage distressed commercial debt across the southeastern United States. My algorithms swept up thousands of toxic loans a month. I had purchased this specific portfolio without even realizing it belonged to my husband's family. I blinked, processing the absolute sheer perfection of the universe. I did not just have leverage over Julian and Trent. I literally owned them. I held the mortgage to Vivian's suburban mansion. I controlled the lien on her retirement accounts. With a single phone call, I could legally foreclose on her home, seize every single asset she possessed, and leave her entirely destitute. Julian thought the administrative consultant he married could not afford a strip mall lawyer. He had no idea he had just threatened the woman who held the deed to his mother's life. "Draft the foreclosure notices immediately, Marcus," I instructed, my voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. I want the immediate acceleration clauses activated for the outstanding loans. I do not want to just seize the assets, I want them legally crushed. And I want the documents bound in premium navy blue cardstock, exactly like the garbage Julian just left in my kitchen. Consider it done, Madam, Marcus replied seamlessly. The legal instruments will be weaponized and ready for deployment by tomorrow morning. I ended the call and the screen went black, plunging the study back into quiet darkness. The absolute ultimate power I now held was deeply intoxicating, but I had no intention of quietly serving Vivian with foreclosure papers in the mail. Vivian had chosen to make this a massive public spectacle. She had chosen to drag my name through the mud, exiling me from the country club and turning my own community against me. She thrived on social standing and public perception. It was only fitting that her total destruction be equally public. A soft chime interrupted my thoughts. My phone vibrated on the edge of the mahogany desk. It was an automated calendar reminder synced to my secondary social email account. Vivian was hosting her highly publicized annual Women of Excellence charity gala this coming Saturday night. It was taking place at the grand ballroom of the downtown Botanical Gardens. It was her absolute crowning social event of the year, heavily attended by the exact same elite wealthy women she had just spent 3 days poisoning against me. She expected me to be hiding in shame, terrified to ever show my face in Atlanta society again. She expected to hold court sipping champagne and accepting pity for her poor, abused son. I reached out and picked up the phone. I looked at the digital RSVP glaring brightly on my screen, waiting for a response. I tapped the button marked Attending. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile into the empty room, feeling the invisible guillotine finally lock into place high above their heads. The time for hiding was over. The stage was officially set. The downtown Atlanta Botanical Gardens had been transformed into a glittering spectacle of high society excess. A line of valets rushed to open the doors of luxury sedans and European sports cars under the massive illuminated awning. I stepped out of my hired black town car into the humid night air. I had not come to the Women of Excellence charity gala to blend in with the crowd. I had come to execute an absolute public massacre. I handed my wrap to the coat check attendant and paused briefly in front of the gilded mirrors lining the foyer. I was not projecting the frantic, defeated energy Vivian had so desperately tried to assign to me. Instead, I was wrapped in a custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown that draped flawlessly across my frame, moving like liquid shadows when I walked. There were no heavy designer logos anywhere on my body. There was no gaudy branding screaming for attention. A single vintage strand of flawless, brilliant cut diamonds rested against my collarbone, catching the ambient light with quiet, untouchable wealth. It was a weaponized elegance designed to communicate absolute dominance. The grand ballroom was a sprawling sea of pastel chiffons, expensive heavy perfumes, and the low hum of networking elite. The moment I stepped through the arched double doors, the ambient noise level in my immediate vicinity noticeably dipped. Heads turned sharply. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a sudden change in air pressure. Every single woman in this room had received Vivian's frantic text messages and church prayer requests. They had spent the entire week discussing my supposed financial crimes and my imminent social ruin. They expected a shattered, weeping woman desperately clinging to the fringes of the room. Instead, they saw an apex predator walking calmly into her chosen hunting grounds. I accepted a flute of vintage champagne from a passing waiter without breaking my stride. I moved through the crowded ballroom with measured, deliberate steps. The very women who had blocked me on social media and demanded my resignation from charity boards just days ago suddenly found themselves entirely unable to meet my gaze. They lowered their eyes and parted like the Red Sea, allowing me a clear, unobstructed path directly to the center of the event. Vivian was standing exactly where she always positioned herself, holding court near the base of the sweeping grand staircase. She was flanked by her most powerful allies, a local superior court judge, a prominent hospital administrator, and the chairwoman of the arts charity who had so coldly emailed me my dismissal. Vivian was practically vibrating with desperate manic energy. She was poured into a vibrant magenta dress that was far too tight and dripping in ostentatious, heavily branded jewelry that screamed for external validation. Her entire aesthetic was loud, flashy, and incredibly cheap compared to the absolute silence of my diamonds. She looked exactly like a woman drowning in debt pretending she owned the ocean. Vivian was mid-laugh, a harsh grating sound, when her eyes locked onto mine across the polished floor. The sound died instantly in her throat. For a split second, genuine unfiltered panic flashed across her heavily contoured face. She had spent 5 days convincing these highly influential women that I was a broke, desperate scammer about to be violently evicted from her son's property. Yet here I was, standing 30 feet away, radiating a level of wealth and composure she could never hope to achieve. But Vivian was a creature of absolute delusion, and she quickly recovered her false bravado. She plastered a vicious, mocking smile onto her face and puffed out her chest, refusing to miss an opportunity to assert her fabricated dominance. She raised her voice deliberately, ensuring her words carried over the soft classical music playing in the background. "Zora, darling." Vivian called out, her tone laced with pure, toxic poison. "I am honestly shocked the security team let you through the front doors tonight. I thought you would be entirely too busy packing up your little cardboard boxes right now." The women surrounding her shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us, but Vivian did not care. She turned to the judge and the hospital administrator, gesturing toward me with a manicured hand, her diamond bracelets clanking loudly. "Ladies, allow me to introduce my soon-to-be evicted blue-collar daughter-in-law," she announced, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the room. She thought she could scam my son out of his fortune, but as you can see, she is currently in the severe denial phase of her inevitable bankruptcy. She is probably hoping to find a new target here tonight, so I would watch your purses. The entire section of the ballroom went dead silent, waiting for my reaction. The socialites held their breath, expecting a massive screaming match. They wanted me to throw my drink, to hurl insults, to break down crying, and run out the front doors in total humiliation. They wanted the chaotic spectacle Vivian had promised them. I did none of those things. I stood perfectly still, the midnight blue silk pooling around my feet. I raised my glass and took a slow, deeply appreciative sip of my champagne. I let my eyes sweep over Vivian's gaudy magenta dress, her desperate posturing, and the nervous shifting of her powerful friends. I did not look at her with anger. I looked at her with profound, surgical pity. I looked at her like she was a tragic stain on the pristine floor. My absolute silence unnerved her more than any screamed insult ever could. Vivian's confident smirk began to falter at the edges, her manicured fingers twitching nervously against her clutch. The social power dynamic in the room instantly inverted. I was not the humiliated victim. I was the executioner, patiently waiting for the right moment to pull the lever. Vivian opened her mouth to launch another desperate verbal assault, but I smoothly looked right past her. I was not here to argue with a woman who did not even legally own the house she slept in. I was here for the architects of this pathetic scheme. My eyes scanned the perimeter of the ballroom, ignoring Vivian completely and landing precisely on the entrance to the VIP lounge. I smiled a slow, terrifying smile as I saw Julian and Trent walk confidently through the archway, laughing together, completely unaware of the digital guillotine currently swinging down toward their necks. I set my empty champagne flute on a passing waiter's silver tray and moved gracefully toward the front of the ballroom where the main stage was set up for Vivian's upcoming keynote address. The crowd parted around me, the heavy midnight blue silk of my gown brushing softly against the polished marble floor. The ambient chatter of Atlanta's elite faded into a dull roar as I focused on the VIP lounge entrance. I did not have to wait long for the inevitable confrontation. Julian caught sight of me first. The smug, relaxed posture he had carried out of the exclusive lounge instantly evaporated the moment his eyes locked onto mine. He stopped dead in his tracks, grabbing Trent by the arm and pointing sharply in my direction. Trent's face morphed into a mask of pure disbelief and raw, unfiltered anger. They immediately altered their path, aggressively cutting through a group of older, wealthy socialites to intercept me just steps away from the edge of the grand stage. Trent reached me first. He did not bother to lower his voice or maintain the polished, restrained facade of a high-end corporate lawyer. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his face flushing a deep, angry red beneath the crystal chandeliers. "Who let you inside this building?" Julian stepped up right beside his brother-in-law, looking me up and down. He took in the custom-tailored gown and the flawless vintage diamonds resting against my skin. His eyes narrowed in absolute confusion. He was desperately trying to reconcile the terrified, trembling woman he had left crying in my kitchen with the absolute vision of untouchable wealth standing in front of him. "Are you out of your mind, Zora?" Julian hissed, his eyes darting around the room to see who was watching. "My mother is going to have an absolute meltdown. You need to leave right now before I call security and have them physically drag you out of here." Trent stepped forward, entirely invading my personal space. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, smelling heavily of expensive scotch and cheap cologne. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here tonight, Zora," Trent growled, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "Where is the deed? You were supposed to have that paperwork signed and delivered to my office by 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Why is it not sitting on my desk?" I did not step back. I did not shrink away from his aggressive posturing. I dropped the victim act entirely. The trembling hands, the fabricated fear, the pathetic pleading I had fed them in my kitchen was gone. I looked at Trent with utter, profound disgust. I let my eyes slowly travel from his slightly crooked bow tie down to his poorly polished shoes, taking in every pathetic detail of a man actively drowning in his own financial incompetence. "You think you can just ignore a legal mandate?" Trent continued, completely misinterpreting my silence. "You think playing dress-up at a charity gala changes anything about your reality? I am going to obliterate your life for this. By Monday morning, I am going to freeze every single asset your parents own. I will garnish your father's pension. I will ruin your credit score so thoroughly, you will not even be able to rent a studio apartment in the worst part of this city. I gave Julian the playbook to let you walk away clean, but now I am going to personally ensure your family is left begging on the streets." Julian grabbed my bare arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. "Stop embarrassing yourself, Zora," he ordered, his voice low and vicious, dropping the benevolent savior act completely. "Stop pretending you belong in this room. You are an administrative assistant who got lucky for 5 years. The ride is over. Turn around, walk out the front doors, and go back to whatever cheap motel you are hiding in. If you make me call the guards, it is only going to make your parents' inevitable bankruptcy that much worse." I looked down at Julian's hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I did not force tears into my eyes or beg him to let go. I simply let the cold, dead silence stretch between us until the sheer, terrifying weight of my stare forced him to realize his mistake. He slowly opened his fingers and dropped his hand, taking a cautious half-step backward. "The terrified little wife you think you married died the moment you tried to use my parents as leverage," I said, my voice dropping to a chillingly calm precision. "There will be no signed deed, Trent. There will be no property transfer. And there will certainly be no frozen pensions." Trent let out a sharp, mocking laugh, crossing his arms over his chest. "You do not get to dictate the terms of your surrender, Zora. You do not have the power, the connections, or the money to fight us." I did not argue with him. I simply lifted my hand and made a subtle, deliberate gesture toward the side of the stage. A woman in a crisp black suit with a heavy headset immediately broke away from the production crew and hurried over to where we were standing. It was the head event coordinator for the Botanical Gardens. Vivian had been screaming at her all evening, treating her like absolute garbage over table arrangements and floral designs. The coordinator stopped directly in front of me, completely ignoring Julian and Trent. "Good evening, madam," she said, her voice filled with absolute deference and respect. "Is everything proceeding to your satisfaction? Should I have security remove these two gentlemen from your immediate vicinity?" Julian and Trent froze. They looked at the coordinator and then back at me, their brains completely short-circuiting. They could not understand why the head of the venue was treating a supposedly evicted administrative assistant like royalty. "Everything is perfectly fine, Claire," I replied, offering the coordinator a warm, genuine smile. But please make sure the audiovisual team is fully prepared for the keynote presentation. I want the transition to be absolutely seamless. Of course, Madame Claire said, nodding sharply. We are incredibly grateful for your firm's anonymous sponsorship tonight. The entire gala would not have been possible without your private funding. Claire bowed her head slightly and hurried back to the production booth to oversee the lighting cues. I turned my attention back to Julian and Trent. Their mouths were slightly open, their faces draining of color as the reality of Claire's words slowly began to penetrate their thick, arrogant skulls. They were standing in a ballroom completely paid for by the woman they were currently threatening to destroy. Claire did not wait for Julian or Trent to recover from their shock. She turned smoothly and signaled the audio technicians stationed by the main amplifiers. Within seconds, a sleek black wireless microphone was brought forward and placed directly into my waiting hand. I tested the weight of it, feeling the cool metal against my palm. I did not look at Julian or Trent again. They were completely irrelevant now, simply two pathetic obstacles I was about to step over. I turned my back on them and walked toward the short set of velvet-lined stairs leading up to the main stage. The heavy midnight blue silk of my gown swept across the steps. As I reached the center of the platform, the spotlight tracked my movement, bathing me in a stark, brilliant glow. The low hum of networking socialites, the clinking of champagne glasses, the soft classical music playing from the string quartet. Every single sound in the grand ballroom died instantly. The silence was absolute. Over 300 of Atlanta's most influential women turned their undivided attention toward the stage. They were staring at the woman they had spent the entire week mocking, eagerly anticipating a public breakdown. I brought the microphone to my lips. I did not yell. I did not let my voice tremble or rise in pitch. I projected my words with a lethal, pristine calm that resonated through the massive speakers and bounced off the vaulted glass ceilings. Good evening, ladies. I began, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. I want to thank you all for attending the Women of Excellence Charity Gala tonight. It is truly inspiring to see so many powerful, influential figures gathered in one room to support a good cause. I paused, letting the opening sentence settle over the bewildered crowd. I looked down into the audience. Vivian had pushed her way to the very front row, her magenta dress glowing under the stage lights. She was staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes, her heavy jewelry completely motionless. Julian had stepped up right behind her, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear. As you all know, I continued, my gaze locking directly onto Vivian. I am Zora, Vivian's daughter-in-law, and I wanted to take a brief moment tonight to publicly congratulate her. The tension in the room shifted. A murmur rippled through the front rows. Vivian's terrified expression faltered, replaced instantly by a wave of greedy, manufactured relief. Julian let out a loud, audible breath and crossed his arms over his chest, puffing out his shoulders. They both smiled. It was a vicious, smug, victorious smile. In their arrogant, delusional minds, they truly believed I had cracked under the pressure. They thought I had walked onto this stage to publicly surrender my family's multi-million-dollar estate to save my parents from Trent's fabricated legal threats. They thought they had won the war. Vivian has been incredibly stressed lately, I said, my voice dripping with fake sympathy, perfectly mimicking the exact tone Julian had used on me in the kitchen. She has been dealing with severe housing transitions, so I think it is only fitting that we all take a moment to congratulate her on her upcoming move. Vivian actually laughed. She turned to the hospital administrator standing next to her and gave a triumphant little nod, adjusting her diamond necklace. She was ready to accept the applause. But I am afraid there has been a slight miscommunication, I said, dropping the sympathetic tone entirely. My voice went ice cold, cutting through the ballroom like a sharpened blade. Vivian will indeed be packing her bags and moving out of her Buckhead mansion very soon. But she will absolutely not be moving into the master wing of my historic Georgia estate. The smug smile vanished from Vivian's face. Julian uncrossed his arms, his posture immediately stiffening. You see, I told the silent, captivated room my husband and his brilliant brother-in-law Trent made a catastrophic miscalculation. They believed my home was marital property. They believed they could legally bully me into signing over the deed by threatening to freeze my parents' pension accounts. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the stage, looking directly down at Trent, who was now sweating profusely under the harsh lights. But my parents are not the simple, naive people Julian claimed they were. I announced, my voice echoing powerfully through the room. Decades ago, they placed our historic family estate into an irrevocable, bulletproof trust. It is completely isolated. It is legally impenetrable. Julian has absolutely zero claim to my property, and his pathetic extortion attempts were entirely toothless from the very beginning. A loud collective gasp erupted from the front row of socialites. Vivian physically stumbled backward, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer humiliation of being exposed as an extortionist in front of her most powerful friends was visibly suffocating her. But I was not finished. The public embarrassment was just the appetizer. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the thick, heavy stack of legal documents. I had specifically ordered my wealth manager to bind them in premium navy blue cardstock, exactly mimicking the terrifying file Julian had thrown onto my kitchen island. I held the stack up high under the spotlight so every single woman in the room could see it clearly. My husband needed my house because he is completely broke, I stated, dropping the ultimate bomb into the dead silence. Julian and Trent have been running a fraudulent luxury car rental business. It is a massive financial black hole. They are drowning in millions of dollars of toxic underwater debt, and in order to secure the bridge loans to keep their pathetic illusion of wealth alive, Trent secretly forged power of attorney documents. I locked eyes with Vivian, who was now shaking uncontrollably. Trent secretly leveraged his mother-in-law's entire retirement portfolio. I revealed, my voice completely unyielding. He took out a massive second mortgage on Vivian's primary estate. Her home, her savings, her entire financial existence has been completely collateralized to cover their catastrophic failures. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Women were whispering frantically, staring at Vivian with a mixture of horror and absolute revulsion. Vivian let out a strangled, horrified sob, turning to look at Trent with sheer betrayal. But the true tragedy of their incompetence, I continued raising my voice to cut through the rising panic, is that they did not even know who bought their toxic debt. They thought they were dealing with anonymous, offshore lenders. I smiled, tapping the navy blue folder against my palm. "Allow me to properly introduce myself to Atlanta society," I said, projecting absolute supreme authority. "I am the founder and CEO of Obsidian Capital. We are the parent company of Vanguard Financial Solutions. My firm specializes in acquiring distressed commercial debt. We bought the entire fraudulent car business portfolio 90 days ago. I own the debt on your business, Julian. I hold the mortgage on your mansion, Vivian. I control every single financial asset you possess. And as of this morning, all loans have been officially accelerated. These are your foreclosure notices. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises." Trent completely snapped. The polished lawyer facade disintegrated into blind, feral rage. He let out a furious scream and lunged forward, charging up the steps to the stage, determined to rip the microphone from my hand and silence me by force. He did not even make it to the second step. Two massive men in sharp black suits stepped seamlessly out of the shadows, perfectly intercepting him. They were the country club security detail, but their salaries had been quietly tripled by Obsidian Capital earlier this week. They were entirely loyal to me. One guard planted a heavy hand squarely in the center of Trent's chest, forcefully shoving him backward off the stairs, while the other stepped protectively in front of me. Trent stumbled and fell hard onto the polished marble floor, landing directly at Vivian's feet. Trent scrambled on the polished marble floor, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The two security guards stood over him like immovable statues, their expressions utterly blank. The collective gasp from the ballroom crowd morphed into a low, frantic murmur of wealthy socialites whispering behind manicured hands. I did not break eye contact with Vivian. She was staring down at her son-in-law, her chest heaving as the terrifying reality of my words finally pierced through her impenetrable delusion. "Let me be perfectly clear, Vivian." I projected, my voice echoing with lethal calm across the vast space. "Trent did not just borrow against your assets. He completely liquidated your future to secure those failed commercial loans. He legally tied your entire retirement savings and the deed to your Buckhead estate to a business that has been functionally insolvent for 8 months. Because they have formally defaulted on those predatory loans, my firm initiated the absolute seizure of your home this very morning. The foreclosure is public record as of 9 o'clock today. You are officially homeless. Vivian let out a sound that did not even seem human. It was a guttural, horrifying shriek of pure primal devastation. She spun around, her heavy diamond necklaces swinging wildly, and looked down at Trent. He was slowly trying to push himself up from the floor, his face completely drained of blood. Before he could utter a single pathetic excuse, Vivian raised her hand and delivered a vicious, echoing slap directly across his face. The sharp crack of skin against skin silenced the entire ballroom. "You stole from me!" Vivian screamed, her voice completely shredding as she lunged at him again. "You took my home! You took everything!" From the edge of the crowd, Camille burst into hysterical tears. Julian's sister had been standing near the cocktail bar sipping champagne and enjoying the show, but now she was sobbing uncontrollably, realizing her husband had just destroyed her family's entire legacy. She pushed her way through the paralyzed socialites, screaming Trent's name. I shifted my gaze to Julian. He was standing near the edge of the stage, staring at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. His perfectly styled hair seemed suddenly disheveled, his expensive leather jacket looking like a cheap costume. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The quiet, compliant administrative assistant he had relentlessly belittled for 5 years was an absolute phantom. He had married a multimillionaire, and he had just handed her the axe to sever his own neck. Julian's knees literally buckled beneath him. The arrogant, predatory man who had cornered me in my own kitchen just days ago collapsed onto the floor. He dropped to his knees right there in front of Atlanta's most elite society, his hands shaking violently as he looked up at me. "Zora, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whimper. He crawled forward, ignoring the security guards, and reached out, trying to grab the hem of my midnight blue gown. "Zora, you have to listen to me. I did not know Trent used my mother's house. I swear to you, I did not know. This was all her greed. My mother pushed him to secure those loans to keep up appearances. It was Trent's horrible business sense that ruined us. I had nothing to do with this. I love you, Zora. You cannot do this to me." I took a deliberate step backward, pulling my silk gown entirely out of his reach. I looked down at him with an expression of supreme boredom. I did not say a single word to him. Instead, I simply raised my hand and offered a brief, subtle signal toward the back of the room. "Marcus." My lead corporate attorney stepped smoothly out from the shadows of the VIP lounge. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, moving through the paralyzed crowd with predatory efficiency. He walked straight up to the stage, entirely ignoring Vivian and Trent, who were still screaming at each other on the floor. Marcus stopped in front of Julian and handed him a thick, heavy manila folder. "Those are your divorce papers, Julian," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. "I am leaving you with absolutely nothing but the crushing, toxic debt you created. You will not see a single cent of my fortune. You will not touch my family's estate. You are financially and legally buried." Julian stared at the manila folder in his trembling hands, weeping openly as his entire existence evaporated. I turned my attention back to Vivian. She had collapsed onto the floor, her expensive magenta dress pooling around her as she sobbed hysterically, her hands clutching her face. "You spent 5 years mocking my family, Vivian," I said, my tone dropping into a cold, deadly register. "You called my parents simple. You called them blue-collar. But you should have paid closer attention. Blue-collar people know exactly the value of a dollar. We know exactly how to work for what we have, and more importantly, we know exactly how to legally protect our assets from opportunistic parasites like you." I did not wait for a response. The entire family was actively turning on each other like rabid dogs. Trent was shouting at Camille, Julian was sobbing over his divorce papers, and Vivian was screaming at the ceiling, mourning the loss of her precious social standing. I turned my back on the stage, entirely unbothered by the sheer devastation I had just orchestrated. I walked out of the grand ballroom, the heavy mahogany doors swinging shut behind me. The chaotic sounds of Vivian and Trent screaming at each other echoed faintly through the botanical gardens, but I did not look back. I stepped out into the cool evening air, breathing in the scent of night-blooming jasmine, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated peace. 6 months later, the Georgia heat wrapped around the historic family estate, like a warm, comforting blanket. I sat on the sprawling wraparound porch, leaning back in a classic wicker rocking chair. The afternoon sun filtered through the massive ancient oak trees, casting dancing shadows across the pristine, manicured lawn. Elijah and Brenda sat next to me, laughing together as my father poured us all tall glasses of ice-cold sweet tea. The absolute silence of the property was beautiful. There were no arrogant husbands demanding compliance, and there were no manipulative mothers-in-law plotting to steal our legacy. Julian's spectacular downfall had been swift and merciless. Following the divorce, he was forced to declare total federal bankruptcy. He was currently living in a cramped, humid studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, managing a failing rental car kiosk to barely make his minimum debt payments. Vivian's precious social standing had been utterly annihilated. Her Buckhead mansion was swiftly foreclosed upon and sold at public auction to a real estate developer who immediately bulldozed the property. Stripped of her wealth and completely exiled from her country club, she had retreated into absolute obscurity. Trent's pathetic attempts to hide his fraudulent paperwork had triggered a massive federal investigation. He had been permanently disbarred and was currently awaiting trial for severe financial fraud and embezzlement. I took a slow sip of my sweet tea, looking out over the incredible estate my parents had worked their entire lives to secure. The trap I had laid in the kitchen that night had executed flawlessly. I had protected my bloodline, eliminated the parasites, and secured my absolute victory. I was entirely untouchable. True security and self-worth do not come from the approval of a toxic family, but from your own resilience and independence. When the people who are supposed to protect you try to tear you down, you must be brave enough to build your own sanctuary. Zora's journey teaches us that you cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Retaining your dignity in the face of cruelty is powerful, but financial and emotional independence is your ultimate shield. The greatest revenge isn't simply destroying those who hurt you, but thriving so completely that their opinions no longer matter. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering content.